Alright, so this is another one of those videos where, despite being planned for a while, I kind of just kept putting off because I really didn't know what the point would be, because I don't really know what I could say that hasn't already been said. Especially since the significance of these movies is something that was kind of not really lost on me, but just kind of went over me for a really long time, because as far as Clueless goes, it really just kind of seemed like another teen movie that I kind of saw bits and pieces of, like, when I was a kid, but other than that, it was just a movie that, while popular, was just kind of popular being for being a teen movie and not really there being anything else to it. And then when Mean Girls came out, I actually did see it in the theater where I would have been like 13 at the time. But I think the main reason I saw it was because I was just really fascinated by how much, like, critical acclaim it got, and how people were kind of making a big deal. Because I saw it late in its run, it was more one of those things of, I just want to see what the big deal is. And then when I saw it, it just kind of seemed like I don't want to necessarily play up that I was like, you know, an idiot of sorts at 13, but needless to say, like, with movies like Mean Girls, just how cleverly it was written, I think, kind of went past me for the simple fact that I wasn't thinking about the fact that it would be that kind of movie, because it just, especially when you're 13, it just looks like a specific movie on the surface, and that's all you really take it as, especially being a 13-year-old boy at that. So later in life, Mean Girls always kind of had a certain popularity, but then that popularity, like, really, really grew over time, especially with, like, the internet age getting bigger, with the whole sort of it being the subject of a lot of memes. Maybe for the better as opposed to worse, like it usually is with that, and just making it more popular, more quoted, and a movie that just people flock to more and more over and over and over again. And this whole phenomenon just kind of happened without me looking, I guess, because it was, to me, it just felt like one day it was Mean Girls came out, people really, really liked it, and then I just kind of let it go to the side and didn't think about it much anymore. And then you fast forward to, like, nowadays, and it is just beyond enormous. Um, and Clueless is kind of in there also, but I feel like nowadays you hear more about Mean Girls. Um, and so, yeah, while pretty much everything has already been said, that's on top of the fact of this is something that was never really, like, these are movies that were never quite in my DNA as much as they were for the audiences that really, really took to them and still do now. So, I'll just see what I conjure, trying to talk about them. Starting with Clueless, because I obviously alluded to that when I did, the video on Emma, just, however long ago that was. And the fact that obviously Clueless is based on Emma, despite the fact that movie-wise, this one came out the year before, and the popularity of this one actually prompted them to do, like, an actual adaptation. Despite the fact that people will argue that Clueless is the better adaptation, it is more or less a very accurate one, just with the time period changed, obviously. And it comes to us from Amy Heckerling, who already has an interesting reputation with this genre, having done, but not just that, but basically doing, like, one of the ultimate quintessential teen movies for both the popular decades. The 80s, she did Fast Times, and then 13 years later, did this, which are obviously take two widely different approaches to more or less the same material. Because while Fast Times certainly has dirtiness to it, leading up all the way to, like, the abortion subplot, this one is just kind of really light almost constantly, but never in a way that, like, hinders it. And I think something that really helps that is the just very sort of self-aware attitude that it has about itself. That's another thing I think when I saw when I was a lot younger, that's the kind of thing that just kind of went totally past me, was that the movie knows exactly what it is and is actually playing with that and not playing into it. So, like, the very opening scene, when we see, you know, the flashy footage of them, and just as you are thinking, this looks like a commercial, Cher comes on in narration and tells us that it's is this a commercial? Is this what we're thinking? And just right then, with the very first line, it's already saying that it's ahead of you in regards to whatever you may be thinking about it going in, which is a really clever way to just start it off instantly. And really the great thing about this movie and the real heart of it and what makes it so successful is the character of Cher and Silver Stone's performance. Because when you see it and you see the kind of character that she is, you kind of like when you're like doing a comparison, your immediate thought might be that Cher is like a Regina George type because she's the one that's kind of at the front of the pack and she's the center of it and she's like the one that's the most desired of the group, at least in most of the story. But there's such a drastic difference between these two groups of friends. And the main thing about it is, even though Cher is like totally and completely self-absorbed, there is like never an ounce of maliciousness in her, even regardless of what she's doing. Even if a lot of things she's doing could potentially be like for her own benefit, there's never anything malicious about what she does or what she has planned for other people. That's just something you can chalk up to her being self-absorbed, but it's never in a way that's like harmful, which is really interesting. And the fact that the movie is like consistent with that, like throughout, and sticks to that. And it's like so really the worst thing she does is the way she pronounces Haitians, I guess, the Haitians thing, which apparently was something that Silverstone actually did, whether or not she denies it now. But there was, I can't remember what it was. I think there was another one where she mispronounced another word horribly, but Hackerling said that they couldn't let that one pass. That couldn't be a character trait. She had to say that one. But going in that, what also makes the performance obviously so strong is how iconic she became, despite the fact that she very easily could have been overshadowed by her wardrobe. And that being one of the things that really, really broke out about the movie, what makes that really interesting also is when you look into it and learn that the costume designer had said something about a lot of people assume that because the wardrobe is such its own character in Clueless practically, that you would think that's where like a lot of the budget was. Apparently the wardrobe was really low budget for the simple fact that they were going for authenticity and not necessarily strictly the fashion thing. Like the costumes were made so that the characters just look like girls that hang out at the mall and aren't like, you know, because the fear was that they would come off looking like professional models or something, which would have taken away from the authenticity of them. So they were able to do that on like a surprisingly low budget, and got the not just the wide number of costumes that they got, but the effect that they ultimately had on the movie's status in pop culture, like forever. It is really interesting to look into. And so obviously, given that it's based on a period piece, you're going to have a lot of characters coming from a lot of different directions. And in a period piece, that can get kind of overwhelming and maybe a bit boring and trying to keep track of everything. But in this teen movie from the 90s that's got a very much more lively way about itself, lends itself to having much more colorful characters and characters that stand out sort of on their own because their personalities can be not as confined as they would be in, like, say, the source material. So, and just all around, you obviously are going to be able to point out the relation between these characters and the characters in Emma. Some of them are a lot more obvious than others, like, I guess the most obvious would be Elton, the Jeremy Sisto character, because I think he's the only one that, like, flat out just kept his name, just has the same name as the character in Emma. But the thing about this character that's kind of weird is it's like, if you aren't familiar with Emma, what Elton's doing in Clueless can be like really confusing. Like trying to place him, if you, like I said, if you're not familiar with Emma or if you haven't seen the movie before, it's like for a while there he's like so oddly handsy to the point that nobody cares. You'd think he's like a boyfriend of sorts, but he's just kind of there. And I thought that he's kind of the only character where I kind of think they didn't really handle him as well as they could have. But that's one character in the vast array of characters that you have here. One of the most notable ones being Paul Rudd's character filling in for Knightley. Paul Rudd's character, whose name is Josh Lucas. So fans of the actor Josh Lucas will find that amusing. Um, and the thing here is, this was like, I mean, not only what I really like about what they do with Rudd here is the thing between Knightley and Emma is supposed to be like, Knightley's almost supposed to seem like maybe a bit insufferable until he's eventually not. And they have that back and forth, but there's always something about Rudd that is so likable that he's carried through his entire career, obviously. But going back to this, you'll kind of see like the real starting point of that charm he's carried throughout his career, and this character and the likability of him. And it's one of those cases where you just kind of really root for them, even despite the odd circumstances that they know each other in regards to leading to a romantic relationship. But at the same time, it doesn't matter. So especially when it gets to the end, when he like really stands up for her, is one of those just really great scenes. But just, even if one of my complaints about this movie is I feel like it kind of ends too abruptly, like that, like him standing up for her is basically the climax. Even though it just kind of feels like another scene in the moment, but yeah, so they together really make that work for those characters. It's also interesting to read into the fact that apparently Paul Rudd had actually auditioned for Donald Faison's character because he had assumed that the character was supposed to be white and like pretending to be black or wanting to be black, which would be a very Paul Rudd way to approach a character and see him in that particular way. But one of the characters I really do want to talk about is Ty, the Brittany Murphy character. Because as usual, when you go back and watch her movies, there's just always the painful reminder of what we lost in talent when we lost Brittany Murphy, because she was just did so many great things with so many characters, but this one in particular was the real standout one. This is the reason why when the news of her death broke, if you remember, almost all the headlines called her Clueless actress Brittany Murphy. And what this character does is, not only does she just kind of have this lovability about her with, stuff like her watching the Mentos commercial and stuff like that, and really to the point that it actually, in the scene when she's, like, at her house, and her dad comes home and, like, barks at Ty to get out of his chair, like, I love the character so much, it personally offends me when he does that. But the thing about this also is, the way she just kind of really turns the expectations of these characters, like, on their heads. Like, obviously they already kind of do that with making Cher's personality much better than you'd expect, despite her self-absorbed nature. But the fact that in a lot of high school movies, it's sort of like the idea is that the people who are like sexually experienced and do drugs and all that are seen as the cool kids, and the virgins and all that are seen as the sort of outcasts or the dorky kids or whatever. And in this, it's the popular kids that like talk about their virginity, and it's Ty who comes in and has experiences with sex and drugs and all that makes her like the odd one out. And I thought that's just a really interesting, unexpected reversal there. And then the whole line of "you're just a virgin that can't drive" is like the ultimate insult in this movie. But there's also the whole thing of when Ty's character gets that development where she starts to get more popular inevitably. And there's the whole scene where she has the brush with death at the mall. And the way it sort of plays on the fact of how things spread around, which obviously this is something Hagelin kind of already dealt with, where it was the scene in Fast Times when he called Mr. Hand a dick, Spicoli did, and then that somehow, the rumor mill turns that into he pulled a knife. And we kind of see that sort of similar progression where Ty's brush with death turns into like somebody thinking she almost got shot or something. So not only does it fit with that just high school environment in general, but it's kind of a nice callback to Fast Times too. I always took it that way. Another character thrown into this is the Churchill character, who is now named Christian, who I mean, I guess he's technically in the closet, but it's so. I mean, I don't know if it's also because if you've seen the movie enough, just how apparent the turn with Christian seems to be at this time, and which obviously brings in the whole irony of Cher calling people like Ty clueless when she goes out with people like Christian, having no idea the truth about his life and his interests. Um, because at first he just seems like, that jackass that wears sunglasses to dance inside. But then, like, as it goes on, it just kind of seems like he's going to be this really douchey character. But then it's like, once we hear that one thing about him and everything starts to make sense, it's like, okay, we kind of like that guy now, and he becomes like one of her best friends because of that, and it just really clears the way. So just the character work like that, and it does it without, at least, I say this with caution because I'm trying to remember from a distant memory. As far as I can remember, they don't make him too like stereotypical or like a caricature, which really helps that also. It makes it sort of believable that it's like, oh, I guess we're going to be best friends now, even though there was that awkward thing where I thought this was something else. Um, and then there's just the side characters like Wallace Shawn. Has kind of a crucial role in this. The just his delivery of could the suicide attempts be postponed to next period, which takes us to Breckenmeyer also, filling in for Martin in this scenario. Like I think every single moment Breckenmeyer has in this movie is probably one of the more memorable, like in the whole thing. Where whether it be the tardy speech or really just anything, he's the one with the suicide attempt. He has the line where he says two very enthusiastic thumbs up. And it's like, oh, well, I wonder if Siskel and Ebert just happened to, yes, of course they did. So, not to say they base their opinions on whether or not Breckenmeyer dropped that line, but coincidence nonetheless. And then there's the whole thing where we see, like, stuff that kind of somewhat seems like it might... stuff that seems very 90s, but then also kind of echoes today to a certain extent. Like when they're on their big-ass cell phones and they're talking in school, and then they have to talk all the way up to the point that they meet each other in the hallway. Sort of gives this vibe of, not to sound like the, old man against technology or anything, but the whole, basically constant communication through texting and social media. You see the similarity even back in 1995 with that particular moment, so there is that. But then there's also the way they handle the conflicts, because obviously there are some conflicts that have to go for a little while because we do have a story to tell, but then at the same time we have stuff where she and Stacey Dash are mad at each other and they're getting ready to really fight and really argue and really get into it. And this would be the particular time in another weaker movie where they would just break up and go their separate ways and sulk until they made up. But I think it's Stacey Dash's character that just says, you know what, I'm really sorry, let's talk when we've mellowed out, and they just walk away and calm down, and it's fine. There's no more conflict, more or less. They just have to cool off, and that's all it takes. And the fact that the characters are that mature, despite the way we've seen them act throughout the movie, really says something, and also kind of shows the whole self-awareness of the movie, and the fact that that's sort of... There's almost... Despite the sort of, almost over-the-top nature of its depiction, there's almost kind of a realism to that, too, of not dragging the conflicts out for the sake of conflict, because that's most of the time done in ways that you only see in movies, and in real life you're just frustrated and waiting for it to come to a logical conclusion. So there's that whole thing, but still, every now and then there might be something that seems a bit dated. Obviously, both of these movies are guilty of using the word retarded pretty freely, which probably doesn't look as good now. We'll actually talk about that again in the one I'm doing after this. It was an epidemic in this time frame, apparently. But yeah, so I'd say really my only issue is I feel like we just kind of get to the end a little too quickly. And it's like even if you know the story, still that's kind of where the point is that we get to, and that's where we want to be, because the relationship between her and Rudd and the way it's kind of slowly built to this, slowly built to it, but at the same time has been happening really before we even realize it. When we realize just the chemistry between the two of them when they're on the couch and all that. And it's just kind of so natural and just happens seemingly almost effortlessly. that it just seems so sudden when we just get to the end, and it's and it's at the point that we need it to be at. Um, but I think really, if anything, that just speaks to how well made the movie is and how well the character interactions are, not just with each other, but the way the characters change throughout the story. Um, yet also stay the same in ways that don't necessarily hinder their character. It's like we can still imagine Cher might be like this when she's older, but it'll only better her life than make her, I guess do the peak too early cliche. Um, so yeah, and when I did revisit this probably a month ago or so, it was like it was a lot better, a lot more not that I disliked it when I saw it, but I didn't really remember much about it. And I feel like after a more recent viewing, it's gonna stick in my head a lot more, and I can really appreciate just how well made it is and how well the characters are written and developed and all that, and the performances really bring that together also. So yeah, so as far as Mean Girls goes, the really impressive thing that Tina Fey did here, and I don't know how many people are aware of it, is the fact that clearly in the credits it's established that Mean Girls is based on a book. But the thing about it is that Tina Fey had basically feared that she backed herself into a corner because I don't know if she wasn't aware or what, but because you've got the title Queen Bees and Wannabes, which pretty much says everything, but it's not a fiction book and doesn't have any of these situations or any of these characters in it whatsoever. It is nothing more than a self-help book. Tina Fey just kind of had to take inspiration from and build this story with these characters. Like it might as well be an original screenplay, to my understanding anyway. And the interesting thing about this movie, I think, when you think of the start of it, and I think it has a lot to do with why I thought about it the way that I did when I first saw it, how I basically saw it as another teen movie, and the sort of clever writing and character work kind of went past me, and I didn't really think about it as anything else but another, teen girl movie, not that dissimilar from Clueless. When actually they're, different in many ways. But I think what also kind of made me think that was that if you just look at it on the surface, it looks like a really, really cliche movie, especially at the start, where you have it in these moments where it's like stuck in this cliche land of the girl goes to high school for the first time and she hates being the new kid. She has the really bad first day. She meets all the different cliques. They make fun of her. She comes home, the parents ask how it was, and she can't even talk because it was so terrible. But the interesting thing about this is that everything I just said is pretty much only lasts the length of the opening credits. So then when she goes back is when things kind of start to... Because the thing about this is that the reason it can get away with that cliche is because this is a movie that is, like, knowingly in this heightened reality of the teen movie. Like, it's already... Like, this is a whole... Like somewhat with Clueless, but I think it's much more apparent in Mean Girls, where it's like... There's a certain authenticity to it in its characters and in, like, the nuances, but overall, there's just something so over-the-top about the whole portrayal of high school life and how it does seem to be in, like, this heightened reality, to where things are the way they are in real life, but to a much more theatrical degree, intentionally, to make the story seem sort of, like, the characters and the personalities and everything just sort of bigger and more exaggerated, which really adds to, like, the fun of it. And once again, also kind of gives it this self-aware nature to kind of almost be one of these types of movies, but also kind of skewer this type of movie at the same time. Once again, much like Clueless did, but their characters are where they really differ in the characters' intentions and all that. Because obviously I was talking about how there's, like, nothing malicious about Cher and Clueless, and now we're literally talking about a movie called Mean Girls. Obviously there's going to be a drastic change here. But there is the whole thing about watching Lindsay Lohan's performance, which is really good, because one of the lines that always kind of stuck out to me, because it's sort of meant to be an insult to her, but it actually makes perfect sense, and that's when they say that Katie's like a Martian. And it's like, that's actually pretty accurate. Because she's come from this entirely different place and has no idea how, like, this is basically an entirely different world to her, to the point where she says, like, all her interactions with adults, like, she's not used to being untrusted by adults, and everything is just so sort of the opposite of the way it was when she lived with her family in Africa when they did all that stuff. It's like this totally, not just a different, continent, but an entirely different world, it seems like. And it's especially when she meets people like the Plastics. But where we get lines from like I think it's Amanda Seyfried that says, "If you're from Africa, why are you white?" And it's just like it's also, I guess, like a level of ignorance or something that she's never quite come in contact with either. Um, and in regards to the movie's sort of personality, like how hard it goes, like against the material, if it's gonna like be kind of a satire of it and really go into that. To my understanding, I can't remember if it was like shot and altered in the editing process or if it was strictly the script stage. But at one point, this was an R-rated movie. I want to say it was kind of just the script stage, where it was stuff like instead of her like being asked if like her muffins buttered, it was apparently the "Is your cherry pop" line would have gotten it an R rating by itself, which I think seems excessive, but I can also kind of see it too. And then there's lines that had to be altered, like the girl with the hot dog was originally a masturbation reference. There's the moment with Lacey Chabert making out with that Jason guy at the party. Apparently, originally in the script when Katie walked in, she was blowing him. So it was going to be a movie that kind of went a lot more for that sort of raunchy R-rated feel before they cut it down, which honestly probably could, like, that's usually something that I think people put a bit too much stock in. But this in this genre with this kind of movie, that is something that can like totally change your movie's personality. In regards to just how sort of hard they go for it, and particularly with that kind of stuff, like talking about Amy Heckerling doing Fast Times and Clueless, and it's like just based on the content, you can tell like how drastically different in tone, as far as the content goes, how different Clueless and Fast Times are. And I'm just imagining the difference between Mean Girls and what would have been an R-rated Mean Girls. I think there's a few more examples, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. But yeah, but even so, as it is, I think the success of the movie does show that you don't have to do that. For some reason, there's a lot of people out there that think you have to go as hard as you can if it's an option. But the fact that it exists as it is, I think, shows that that's really not necessary, and it can still carry itself with what it has without having to take it across another line. And I guess speaking of the word line, obviously the whole thing, much like Clueless, is just filled with these lines that are just immortal at this point. One in particular that's always really stood out to me was the fetch line, kind of, I guess, because of the irony of it, because of her trying to build it up like 2 or 3 times throughout the movie, and then the ultimate payoff being that fetch isn't going to happen. And I guess what's always stood out to me is the irony of it, that the line saying that something is being forced to be popular but will never be, this line ended up being one of the most quoted lines of the entire movie. So I was kind of like, there's just something poetic about how that turned out. And then you look at the way it portrays the other characters, that, once again, in another movie could have just been, stereotypes or caricatures or whatever. Really, like, the way it portrays the teachers in it is one thing. Because we do obviously have the sort of funny jabs, like seeing the gym teacher try to do sex ed, that whole scene, which is really funny both times. But then you get Faye's character, where it's like, she does kind of start off like she's gonna be a punchline, but then they like humanize her just enough, where in movies like this, oftentimes the teachers don't really get that treatment. Or they get like one personality trait and just that's what they are. You can also throw that at Clueless in a good way, with the way they handled the Walsh and Twin Goblin characters and that whole storyline in itself. But the Faye character in particular does feel like, to bring Paul Rudd back into it, sort of in that, not as effective as it is in the other movie, but the Paul Rudd character in The Perks of Being a Wallflower comes to mind, and with teacher characters like that. So I like how much she was able to stand out. Having written the part for herself, it makes sense. And then there's the case of Damien, which is a really, actually, kind of nice story when I was reading into it, where Daniel Franzese is actually an actor that has since come out, but hadn't at the time. He came out like a decade after the movie. And what I read, I think, I'm very much paraphrasing something I read like months ago, but something along the lines of one of the things that helped him was, after having played this character, seeing how much he was able to help other gay people, particularly kids, because there was that whole, obviously, you know, gay kids are going to be outcasts in certain environments, and just given the way people react to them. And then after Mean Girls came out, he started getting, like, a lot of feedback saying that the character of Damien basically, like, made them cool when they were in school, because they saw him or her or whoever and was like, oh, you're gay like Damien, that's awesome, you should be in our friend group. And it just kind of was this whole thing that, like, I guess opened gay kids in schools up to a lot of people after this movie gained its popularity. So that's obviously really nice also. And Daniel Franzese in general is an actor that I kind of really wish I think he's doing, like, he's, like, on, like, the stand-up scene now, but, I do always have thought that, especially after this, before this, I mainly knew him for, Bully, but, especially after this, I feel like he's one of those actors that really should have been the case of, and I know this isn't always a good thing, but I'm surprised he wasn't one of those actors that started showing up in, like, everything after this. Because he was so good in this, and his comedic timing is just so perfect. Especially the way he and Lizzie Kaplan bounce off of each other throughout it also. And speaking of perfect comedic timing, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Tim Meadows. Who I think is Tim Meadows is what stood out to me the most the first time I saw it. With that way where he just has, like, this sort of quiet contempt for everything that he does, but he never quite goes over the top. Like when they're in the gym and he does the whole make some noise thing, and then the way he just abruptly cuts it off. The whole thing where he says that he's gonna cancel the prom, but then, oh wait, he's not gonna do that because they already hired the DJ. And then he'll keep them till 4 because that's the farthest he can keep them. Just all those little line deliveries are just absolutely perfect. Like I said, just that hidden not so hidden contempt that he has for everything around him, just makes for this great comedic character throughout. And like I said, I was talking about individual performances, but the comedic timing of the movie in general and its script is all just perfect also, with just these little scenes. Like I was talking about the sex ed scene that keeps popping up. The moment where they're watching Friday the 13th 2, just as Katie bursts through the door at just the right moment. Just all those little individual moments also, on top of the scenes that are, like, you know, quoted endlessly and instantly recognizable and all that stuff. It all works. And even her love story with Aaron Samuels doesn't feel too, like, played out or cliche, just mainly based on the way that she handles it. And the way that she sort of crushes on him in that particular way, to where it doesn't seem like it's going particularly too over the top. And when, obviously, conflict is going to happen, the movie keeps going, and it gradually gets to the stopping point it needs to get to without her having to, like, stop and lay in bed heartbroken for, like, 20 minutes of the movie, which is what the movie that movies like Clueless and Mean Girls are kind of sticking it to would do. So, yeah, and then eventually, obviously we have this ongoing, one of the most fascinating aspects of the movie is the ongoing war with Regina, obviously, and the way that it's, the great thing about this is that I talk about how this movie is obviously going to have a certain meanness to it because it's in the damn title, and it's in a certain character's nature. But the thing about it that makes me not immediately say, I prefer Clueless because Clueless isn't malicious, when Mean Girls is doing the mean aspect of it, it's still having, like, so much fun with it. Just, like, the whole war between them, and then when it gets to, like, the conflict eventually gets so over the top by when we get to the point that everybody's just running around the halls frantically. And obviously Katie keeps envisioning they're just animals from Africa attacking each other, because that's what she's most familiar with. There's still something about it that doesn't go too into that mean category because it's having too much fun with itself. Like this could have been, this could have easily tried to make itself a knockoff Heathers and maybe tried to go like dark or something. But that it avoids anything like that, it's all the better for. And I think that's another reason that it's kind of better they avoided that R rating they could have very easily had if they'd kept those original jokes in the script. So it kind of like it's better off on the other side of that line. So, and then obviously it's able to Faye's able to inject like this sort of wisdom in it, and it's very because it's very much like a movie in disguise, where it's like you have all these characters, you have like the whole Amanda Seyfried character and all that, and like we have scenes of like Lloyd like slapsticking into a trash can or whatever, and it's like just on the surface you would never suspect this movie has the brain that it has or has the things to say that it does, and has the care for its characters that it does. And obviously, what's under that disguise is, I think, what has made it really stand the test of time with people, and what makes people go back to it over and over and over again. Even if I'm somebody that's only seen it like twice, I can see why that would be. As far as these two, I think as far as if I prefer one over the other, I think I'm more likely to revisit Clueless. I think mainly just its characters sort of stand out more. But overall, just both of them accomplish the same things in regards to having all the different characters and all the side characters with all the different personalities. The instantly quotable lines, the characters that could very easily be hateable, but they're just so well crafted and so well written that we love them all anyway. And everybody's just so damn happy at the end of both of them that it's that it's really really hard to resist. So that's pretty much what I would say about these. So I'm going to cut this off and go right into the next one, and then you're going to have like 4 verses in a row, if not more. So I'm really trying to get caught back up in that whole area where it was just gone. So we'll see what all that is. So until that, that's it for